Welcome to Breaking the Narrative, a Stand With Us Canada podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Primorano, and in each episode, we'll dive into the fight against anti-Semitism and the delegitimization of Israel. From student leaders to community advocates, we'll explore how people are standing up and making a difference. New episodes drop every other Thursday, so let's get into this week's conversation. Welcome back to another episode of Breaking the Narrative. My name is Jesse Primorano and I'm your host. And today's guest is someone whose voice has become a fixture on international media since October 7th, Eylon Levy. Eylon is a British-Israeli government spokesperson, the government spokesperson and media advisor who served as one of the most prominent English language voices for Israel during the early months of the war against Hamas and all the way through to today in an unofficial role. He's continued to be a loud and proud voice for the state of Israel, clarifying and correcting misinformation that we see in the media day to day. Eylon's taken on some of the most hostile interviewers, on this topic, BBC, Sky News, CNN, but today we've got him here with a friendlier interviewer and a friendlier host, and we're so glad to have you, Eylon. Thanks for taking the time to join us.
Jesse, so good to catch up with you. I've missed Canada, so hopping on a podcast with you over online is the next best thing.
The next best thing, we made the mistake of bringing you in November of last year. So
The mistake
wow. In terms of...
That hurts.
No,
I'm
saying
hurts,
the
Jesse.
mistake... The mistake was on our side of not bringing you now when we're experiencing, beautiful weather and where the protesters are not as littered all over campuses because it's summertime. So it's
you
much
left
more
the good weather for
country.
Natasha. She's a real rock star, and
Exactly.
I'm sure the Canadian Jewish community appreciated her.
We did. We've had it was from you to Natasha. We've been able to really bring some phenomenal speakers to the community. And Natasha did a wonderful job and was definitely a nice follow-up to build that British-Canadian-Israeli connection, up. But, your tour here had a lot of great feedback as well. And I think that our community is really excited to have the chance to hear from you again, even if it's just digitally. Speaking of Natasha, her visit to Toronto, to Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary was preceded by what everyone saw was an egregious display by Piers Morgan on his show, doing what he does best, which is silencing the truth, silencing pro-Israel voices, something you're dealing with every day. So just to start off, I'd love to sort of get a bit of an idea from you. What is it like always having to be on the defensive, always knowing that your words are likely to be twisted, and knowing that you're dealing with such an important topic that you have to be so careful in how you communicate? What's that like for you each day?
Yeah, Piers Morgan is a funny one. I was interviewed on Israeli media asking what on earth is happening to him, and I explained he's simply Britain's most successful YouTuber, and he's managed to crack the algorithm. Outrage works, having people shouting at each other works, and making about Israel and the Jews works. Hate the game, not the player. His people have been chasing me for a while to come on and debate all sorts of cranks and weirdos, and I've refused. And then Piers Morgan blocked me on Twitter and said I wasn't wanted on his show. But ever since then, his team have continued to reach out to try to bring me on for interviews. So I'm getting rather mixed messages from the Piers Morgan Uncensored show. Look, Israel finds itself definitely on the back foot being defensive, because this is a war that Israel is fighting not on 7 fronts, on 8 fronts. The 8th is attacks on Jews and Israelis across the diaspora. And the media dimension of that is not a sideshow to the physical battle. It's part of the physical battle. Israel's enemies want to destroy Israel. I mean, not to start us off on too grim a note. They want to destroy Israel. They think it'll be easier to destroy Israel if the world is convinced that Israel deserves to be destroyed. And that's why they throw every nasty word in the rule book, hoping that good, ordinary, decent people in Canada or elsewhere will conclude that Israel... it's not the problem that Israel is committing crimes. Israel is the crime. It has no reason to exist. It's standing between us and the perfect world and utopia, and therefore the country should be destroyed, and at minimum you should step aside as someone moves in to destroy it. But I do think it is important that Israel assign a fair share of blame and responsibility at the feet of other people, because it is true that Israel is fighting in the most fiendishly difficult conditions in Gaza, but there are people who are responsible for that. Hamas mustn't be let off the hook for its human sacrifice strategy just because it's a jihadi death cult from which we can't expect any better. UN agencies that have been riddled with Hamas and other terrorist groups. The NGOs that have been waging pure political warfare against Israel. The organizations that refuse to support humanitarian evacuations at the beginning of the war. They have blood on their hands because they prevented efforts to separate the civilian population from the Hamas fighters, allowing them to be used as human shields and sacrifices in urban areas. So I think there's plenty of blame to go around. And certainly when making the case for Israel in the horrible context of a war, it's important not to find ourselves entirely on the back foot and explain that there are plenty of people who shoulder an absolutely massive share of responsibility for the terrible predicament we're in now.
But it seems so difficult. So, I mean, for us at least, we're working with students, trying to empower them to go out to have these conversations with their peers. To me, there's like such a clear correlation between the fact that Hamas has put the Palestinians in Gaza in the situation they're in today, and people don't seem to be able to realize that. So as it relates to some of the smaller players that you mentioned, the NGOs, etc., how do you highlight that for people? How do you bring that into, the forefront in a way that people can understand?
These NGOs have a massive advantage, and that's the halo effect. When you have a name like Save the Children or Feed the Hungry or, something along the, Clothe the Homeless, or whatever these organizations are called, they have a halo effect. And how can you possibly disagree with someone who has UN expert written on her business card, even if it's an unrepentant anti-Semite who lies about being a lawyer and has just become the first UN official to be sanctioned by the United States? There is a halo effect around them. And I think it is important to remind people what they were saying on and after October 7th. Show me what you said on October 7th, and I will say who you are. Francesca Albanese, for example, is someone who spent October 7th tweeting about why the Jews basically had this coming because of the context of whatever. Other organizations that weren't able to even shed a crocodile tear for the victims of October 7th. People claiming, throwing around the word genocide in the very first week of the war. This is not fair criticism. This is full-on political warfare by people who buy the Palestinian narrative, hook and sinker, and they're not subtle about it anymore. They're not making pretenses of neutrality, and I think that makes it easier for us to make the case that these organizations are not neutral arbiters. They are political activists, and they have an agenda, and they have an ideology, and that ideology is completely weighted against Israel and is therefore in the service of terrorist organizations with horrific amounts of blood on their hands.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I'm not sure even if it's that these people are buying into the Palestinian narrative or if they've just long bought into the anti-Jewish narrative, right? Like that the Palestinians are effectively just another people that are, seen as those being oppressed by the Jews through thousands of years of history. This, omni-powerful people has, managed to oppress people, and the Palestinians are sort of the next in line. It feels like in some cases that there's not real support for them, because if there was, people would look deeper into, well, what is the problem that the Palestinians are facing? How is Hamas impacting them? And so when we see this type of misrepresentation in the media where they take, numbers and claims by the Gaza Health Ministry and by other NGOs, like you said, with, beautifully lovely sounding names, when they parrot this information back to the public, do you think they're doing it, with a level of intentionality where they're trying to distort the narrative, or do you think that they believe this, that they truly genuinely believe what they're hearing?
I think many of these NGOs genuinely believe it's not that Israel is committing crimes, it's that Israel is a crime. They think that Israel's foundation is its original sin. They think that the problem is that this country exists and there's nothing that it can do that would be right short of dissolving itself, absorbing millions of hostile immigrants and renaming itself Palestine. And therefore they don't give it a fair shake, and there isn't a fair hearing. And we have all these human rights organizations and human rights experts saying Israel's doing this wrong, Israel's doing that wrong, and never consult a single real military expert who has any idea of what things look like on the battlefield. And that's because events on the battlefield don't interest them. It doesn't matter what Israel does, they'll always spin it against it. If it's the heroic rescue operation of hostages where we then had people like Kenneth Roth saying that it was illegal because the undercover officers were undercover rather than in uniform, and because they didn't warn them in advance they were coming, even though we know that the captors have instructions to shoot the hostages if the IDF gets close. Or the beeper attack, which is by definition the most precise military operation in military history and military future. And people were claiming, of course, that that was some indiscriminate booby trapping of civilian objects, as if the military communications devices handed out to Hezbollah were civilian objects. Israel is not given a fair shake. But as long as these organizations have that halo effect, and as long as they enjoy so much respect and admiration within liberal circles and ruling circles, they continue to enjoy that advantage. And it's tremendously dangerous because they're subverting the values of human rights in order to perpetrate a conflict. And we're all paying the price for these organizations refusing to attribute the Palestinians any agency, not telling them, you know what, you have responsibility for your own fate, maybe you should sue for peace. Telling them, go all the way from the river to the sea, down with Israel. It has no right to exist. It needs to dissolve itself. And when they fuel the Palestinians' perceptions that Israel is temporary, they encourage Palestinian rejectionism. And that rejectionism, that refusal to accept Israel's existence in any circumstances, in any borders, is what is fueling this conflict. And they have responsibility for that.
Absolutely. So let's talk about this conflict. Let's talk about what's going on right now in Gaza. There are obviously ceasefire talks that are ongoing. We've had conversations, some more positive, some, a little more negative. What's your perception on, where things are at right now? Do you see this as something that in the next, month or two might be resolved between Hamas and Israel at the very least?
Israel stands at a junction now. It has two choices. The original goals of bringing the hostages back and defeating Hamas have come unstuck. Their intention, this is the assessment of the IDF chief of staff himself. And there are two directions. One direction is to say we're going for the full conquest of the Gaza Strip. We're going to impose Israeli military rule. We're going to evacuate people from the north towards a humanitarian city in the south. Many Israeli politicians would then like to encourage Gazans to emigrate voluntarily, hoping that will solve the problem. The other option is to leverage the advantages that Israel's achieved on the battlefield in order to get a hostage deal, a ransom. Okay, we're still paying a ransom to terrorists, but a ransom on terms that we can live with. And what Hamas is demanding is not just the release of thousands of terrorists, but the end of the war. And there is a growing call within Israel, and it's not on the left. It's from leaders like Avigdor Lieberman, Naftali Bennett. By the way, even the head of the army as well, saying continuing the military operation is endangering the hostages. To say, look, let's end the war, let's get a deal to bring the hostages home and find a way to deal with a much weaker Hamas that remains in the Gaza Strip, and accept that we're not going to achieve that goal of completely removing Hamas from power. And that's difficult to accept, but Israeli society really isn't going to heal if the hostages are abandoned there in Gaza in favor of a military campaign that is going to see even more Israeli soldiers killed, not to speak of the suffering on the other side, without a plan for how to really replace the Hamas governance. Who is going to replace Hamas's governance inside the Gaza Strip? That's been the holy grail and perhaps the biggest flaw of Israel's military strategy to date. So I was honored last Saturday night to host the hostage families rally in central Tel Aviv. It's the second time that I hosted it. The first time was on day 225 of the war way back when. This was day 638. I couldn't believe we were going back and there are still hostages trapped in Gaza. And to say Israel has reached incredible achievements now across the Middle East. The victory over the Iranian Axis has been far more comprehensive than anyone could have imagined. And this is crunch time. And now is the time to make that deal, to pay that ransom, to end the war, and bring the hostages home. The problem is you can't really end the war unless you're ending it on terms that Hamas agrees to. So is Hamas going to agree to allowing Israel to maintain a perimeter inside the Gaza Strip? Not sure. I don't think they will. But ultimately, a deal has to be acceptable to both sides, and the other side is a genocidal death cult. And so Israel really does have, and here is, by the way, where I'm sympathetic to the argument for continuing the war. And I don't think this is Bibi's war or a political war or only for the sake of the right-wing elements in the Israeli coalition. The government has an impossible task. It has to bring the hostages home, and it has to make sure it's safe for them to go home. But Hamas is still shooting rockets at the kibbutzim that were massacred on October 7th. There was a siren in Nirim just the other day. A rocket hit near where they were rebuilding houses. The communities in the kibbutzim can't go back if Hamas is going to rebuild its terrorist army and keep shooting rockets. So there is this impossible task ahead. But I think in Israel, nearly 2 months into the war, an understanding of that you sort of have to pick a path. You can go all out towards conquering the Gaza Strip, disarming Hamas man by man, but it's going to come at huge cost, and it does mean giving up on the hostages, because Hamas is going to hold on to them to try to get an end of the war. By the way, I don't think Hamas is ever going to free all of the hostages. Or you say, we're in a strong position to get a ransom on terms we can live with. Let's strike a deal. Let's get the hostages back, and we will worry about Hamas later. That's the dilemma in Israel now.
I mean, it sounds like, as you describe it, it sounds like there isn't really even much of a dilemma in the sense of that, trying to go down the path of making this deal ends up in any case with Hamas maintaining their sort of, their existence in Gaza, Basically, what I'm trying to say is that I don't see Hamas agreeing to a deal that works for Israel. So continuing to go down that path is, presumably going to cause more damage than the other side. But
exactly. In order to the dilemma is this: in order to get the hostages back today, and I think we should make a deal with the devil. We have a responsibility to the citizens who were ripped out of their beds, but I think we should be clear-eyed about the costs. We are getting the benefits now and pushing the problems to later on, because Hamas will try to rearm. Hamas will try to rebuild. If we say we're going back in, if Hamas violates the ceasefire, it means that we go in on the timing that is suitable for Hamas after they've managed to build more booby traps and IEDs. And just the other day we woke up to news of 5 soldiers killed from a remotely detonated roadside bomb. It will cost lives in future. But you've got the hostage movement here saying, look, we've been checkmated. We've been checkmated because they're holding on to the hostages in tunnels under Gaza right now, and there is no time for them. So what I'm trying to say is, I think it's perfectly okay, and we get this question a lot in the diaspora, to what extent can you be critical of Israel? Be critical. Like, Israel has to make impossible decisions, and there are trade-offs either way. But I think it's possible to be critical without saying, this is all political and going down the cynical road, because there are genuine security issues that will have to be dealt with and that aren't going to go away, even if you make a deal with the devil to get the hostages back.
Yeah. At the end of the day, everything is political, but what politics are is just different perspectives on the same issue. And I think that's one thing that's been a bit misconstrued. Not that I'm going to come to anyone's defense here, but is the notion that this war is only ongoing for somebody or some group of people's personal interests. I think it's a very nuanced situation, but I think you've actually articulated it very nicely in a way for our viewers today in hearing that, we have to pick a path as soon as possible, that this is now a war that, I remember going to rallies for 2 months and 3 months and 6 months and thinking like, wow, 6 months that these hostages have been there. This is unbelievable. And eventually you get to a point where, like you said, maybe we've just been checkmated. And despite wanting to be the strongest and, proudest nation, sometimes you do have to accept deals that may not be in your best interests for the best interests of the country. I know that may not have made sense, but what's the sentiment on the ground in Israel? Like I heard, by the way, did a wonderful job at the hostage rally this past weekend. My friends who were there said that you spoke beautifully, but my experience at the hostage rally, I've been twice now. It feels like each time the crowd gets bigger and the politics become more balanced. It started as like a very left-leaning, progressive kind of crowd, and it feels like now we're seeing people from across Israeli society speak to a hostage deal. Is that the sentiment that you're feeling on the ground too, or are they still divided?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a perception that it's a political thing, but actually there are two hostage rallies. There's the more diplomatic one that takes place in Hostage Square, and then there's a more political one, which is sort of most of the people who are at the anti-government protests before the war who are doing their own thing because they think that this is too restrained and too diplomatic. And the rally that I was speaking at, it was very important for me that the message be very unifying and above politics, and talking about leveraging the incredible opportunities that we have now with Israel's regionally dominant position to try to act from a position of strength. And it wasn't attacking the government and throwing accusations, although the hostage families who speak from the heart are able to say whatever they want. What I'll say in Israel is what's changed is that the war is now less intensely felt on the home front. Remember that for months after October 7th, we had sirens because of rockets from Gaza falling deep inside Israel. 60,000 people evacuated in the north because of rockets from Hezbollah. Now, I mean, we've just had a 12-day war with Iran in which we had rocket sirens several times a day. And there were enough Iranian missiles that got through that you really didn't know when you went down into your rocket shelter whether there was going to be a house to go back up to. And now, if you don't listen to the news, your awareness of the war is the occasional Houthi missile siren. We had one at 5 o'clock this morning. Actually, one of the good things now, we get an alert on our phones before the siren saying in the next few minutes there will be a siren, get near a shelter, which is amazing because it means at 5 o'clock in the morning you've got time to wake up, to go to the toilet, to grab a bottle of water, and then go down calmly instead of having to run down like a madman to make it there in 90 seconds. But apart from that, Israel is able to go back to routine. There isn't an expectation that there will be a missile at any moment. People are beginning to go back. People are going back to their lives. But you can't escape the news of the number of men we've been losing inside Gaza. Just yesterday, there was a soldier killed during an attempted abduction inside Gaza. He was soldier 889 of the October 7th war. Day before yesterday, there were 5 soldiers killed, 14 others injured in a roadside bomb attack in the northern Gaza Strip. Just a few days ago, we lost a young British-born soldier by the name of Nathan Rosenfeld. He was killed in Gaza, and I went to the Shiva. I went to the Shiva. It was important for me because his family made Aliyah from the UK, so I wanted to reach out. I obviously can't go to all of them. And his mother told me, he was killed because we're not committing a genocide, right? If we wanted to just bomb the whole place from the air and not endanger soldiers, then we would do that. But he was killed because we're taking care and putting our soldiers at risk on the ground to try to mitigate harm to civilians. And that was very painful. That was very painful to hear. But to get back to your question, there is this sense that we're sort of stuck. The war in Gaza, at least. The war in Iran was a phenomenal success. But on the Gaza front, there's this sense that we're at a stasis, we're treading water. The Hebrew word is dishdush. It sort of means treading water or dragging your feet or inertia, or there's a sort of stalemate, and that the country really has to decide whether to go big or go broke. Like, now is the time to get some sort of ceasefire deal, even if it's a ceasefire deal that gets only half the hostages out, or go in at full strength. But this foot dragging game, as people would call it, is something that's unsustainable. People really want this war to be behind us. The problem is Israel wants this war to be over because we want to win it. Hamas wants this war to go on forever because Hamas defines itself as an armed resistance group and says it will never give up its arms because its reason for existing is to continue waging against jihad, to continue waging jihad against Israel until there is no more Israel. So we know that even if the war ends, it's not a permanent end of the conflict. And it's misleading of media to speak of Hamas demanding a permanent end to the conflict because Hamas's reason for existing is permanent jihad. Hamas wants a pause to the conflict so that it can rearm, rebuild, and then continue to wage war at Israel at a moment of strength. And even if we do go for this ceasefire deal, we have to be aware the enemy hasn't changed its stripes.
And so do you get any sense of, what comes next in Gaza after all of this? I mean, I know it's hard to know because we don't even know what the short-term outlook is for Gaza. But let's imagine a scenario where we get some of the hostages back, where Hamas stays in power, where, this whole thing with Israel and the corridor that they want, I'm blanking on the name of the corridor they want to keep soldiers in.
The Morag corridor.
Sure? Right. So again, be that as it may, whether they're there or they're not there, what do you know if there's some sort of plan? What do you think would be an effective solution to, because we can't have this existential threat sitting on our border forever. There's either got to be peace or an end to Hamas or, something of that nature. What do you see as a viable strategy for Israelis and Gazans to live side by side?
Look, the government at the moment is saying that if there isn't going to be a ceasefire that releases the hostages, then the IDF is going all in. Gazans will have to move to a humanitarian city on the rubble of Rafah. That's where they will receive their humanitarian aid. They'll be allowed in after confirming that they're not members of Hamas. And then Israel can go after the whole of Hamas in the northern Gaza Strip. And then they want to encourage voluntary emigration. That anyone who wants to leave should be allowed to leave. Asylum is, of course, a human right, but some Israeli leaders would like to incentivize them to leave. And they want to do that out of an understanding that there is no way to live peacefully next to these people. Because as every news anchor tells me, don't you think that by bombing them, you're only going to create a new generation of jihadists, right? There's, I think, an understanding on both sides. The continuation of the war is going to raise a generation of bitter people. They've been raised on Hamas's ideology. The war hasn't made them more moderates. So it would be best for all concerned if they start a new life elsewhere. For what it's worth, I agree with the vision that the Prime Minister laid out at the beginning of the war, where he spoke of the prerequisites for peace in Gaza as being the 3 Ds. You have to destroy Hamas, demilitarize Gaza, and de-radicalize Palestinian society. But I don't think the world is ready for what that means. Demilitarizing Gaza means someone has to enforce the demilitarization of Gaza. And that means Israel. It means a permanent Israeli security presence in Gaza, an ability to go in and attack Hamas in order to stop it building itself up, rather than allowing Hamas to have immunity as it rebuilds its military machine. And de-radicalization means the UN agencies that produced the October 7th monsters need to take responsibility and start educating towards peace. That means weaning them off the ideology that they are all refugees with a right to immigrate to Israel and that they get free healthcare and education at the expense of the Canadian taxpayer via UNRWA until a time that they're able to move to Israel. That's what has to happen, okay? I think this war needs to end with the Palestinians losing and knowing they've lost and being forced to accept Israel's permanent existence, okay? I went, a few months ago, I was in the European Union for meetings with their senior officials, and I met the person in charge of Gaza reconstruction. Not an enviable task. I said, if Hamas is still in power, the reconstruction of Gaza means the reconstruction of Hamas. And you cannot have peaceful reconstruction if you're trying to rebuild houses and through the other hand you're telling them that 70% of people in Gaza are still refugees because their great-grandparents were displaced in Israel's War of Independence and they have a so-called right of return. They're not going to rebuild peacefully if they think that those quote-unquote refugee camps are temporary until they get to move to Israel. So it's possible to have peaceful coexistence, but it means the world needs to understand why the conflict endures in the first place. It endures in the first place because the Palestinians believe a myth that Israel's creation was unjust, that Israel is temporary and that with enough violence, Israel can be destroyed. If Israel is allowed to establish security control in Gaza, and you wean the Palestinians off that ideology and make them understand it's never going to happen, if you're saying you can't leave Gaza because Gaza is your home, we'll take it to its logical conclusions. Gaza is your home, not Israel. But unfortunately, as long as all the world's academics and NGOs and UN officials are saying you can't displace people from Gaza because Gaza is their home, but actually they have a right to live in Tel Aviv because Gaza isn't their home, you are fueling more and more conflict. And it means that if people stay in Gaza, of course there's going to be another round of conflict. And if it's not Hamas, it'll be some other jihadi outfit. This isn't a right-wing talking point. It's what I was being challenged by mainstream media, saying surely after the war people will only be more embittered and there will be more jihadists. Yes, that's why you have to tackle the ideology that led people to celebrate when Shani Luk was being hauled through the streets of Gaza on day one of the war. You have to tackle that ideology. Destroy Hamas, demilitarize Gaza, de-radicalize Palestinian society. You want to live in peace next to people in Gaza? Those are the prerequisites for peace. If you're not willing to accept those prerequisites for peace, the conclusion is there is no way to live in peace next to the people in Gaza.
You talk about having to tackle that ideology, but it feels even worse that not only is the ideology, thriving in Gaza, but that it's actually multiplying and amplifying all over the world, right? Like the notions of jihad and martyrdom and intifada thing, to hear the word intifada in the streets of Canada is still something that I just can't get over, right? That people are chanting on, to globalize the intifada. Do they understand, these people who take buses and subways to work, that when they blow up a bus in Toronto, it's not just going to affect the Jews, the people that support Israel. It's going to affect the entire country. And this is what's happening right now, is it's the same thing, that when we sort of empower and not empower, sorry, but engage with these narratives of, these the Gaza Health Ministry and, Hamas talking points, we're not actually doing anything to help the Palestinian people. You just said it, right? By promoting this concept, what's happening is we're promoting continued warfare and continued attacks and continued death and blood. And somehow people are failing to understand this idea, like you said, that Gazans can't belong both in Gaza and in Tel Aviv at the same time. You have to pick an idea. And when you see them, so let me finish this, sorry. When you see them go through and double down on this idea, it shows really that they don't care about the Palestinians. They just care about seeing Israel gone, right?
The self-righteous, keffiyeh-clad knuckleheads on the streets of Canada and New York and London are not only bringing political violence to your country, they are fueling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because they are aggravating the root causes of this conflict, okay? Either the root cause of this conflict is that Israel exists, or the root cause of the conflict is that people don't accept Israel exists. And my narrative is that the root cause of the conflict is people don't accept Israel exists and that it has a right to exist. You are disempowering moderate Palestinians who may want to compromise and may want to reconcile with Israel by telling them, no, if you go for less than from the river to the sea, you are a sellout, you are a fraud, you cannot make peace with a colonial, imaginary Zionist entity. They are condemning us to further conflict by empowering extremists on the Palestinian side. And they then can't be surprised if Israel reacts in a way they don't like when they are telling the Palestinian side that it's black and white, that it's us or them. I don't want this conflict to be us or them. But when you have people in the West telling the Palestinians it's you or them, it's black or white, neither can live while the other survives, you need to go from the river to the sea. They are encouraging them to wage a forever jihad against Israel. And if people really cared for peace, really cared for human lives, really cared for Palestinians, they would tell them, guys, it's time to take responsibility. Israel exists. Your 100-year-old war against a Jewish state in any borders whatsoever has failed. It's time to sue for peace. Because the longer they sustain the illusion that Israel will crumble like a colonial entity, the less likely the Palestinians will ever come to terms with reality, because you're basically letting them live in their own Truman Show, in which they believe that that Israel's existence is temporary and one day it will be overpowered. And it's not going to happen.
Well, it's very, very well said. Truman Show. I think that's spot on. So where do we go from here? I mean, I know people ask you this all the time. I've already asked you this, so I don't really want to dive too deep into the question. But I mean, when you have, we talk about this notion that the Palestinians are effectively pawns, I always say, for the Iranian regime, right? That no one's actually interested in their best interests. They are interested in using them to see the state of Israel destroyed. But what does it mean for the state of Israel? What does it mean for the future of Israel's place in the world? Not only in the context of what we're talking about, but also with media. Like, you're looking people dead in the eye who are denying, rape, who are denying terror tunnels, who are denying human shields in Gaza. What does it mean for Israel's place in the world when so many are unwilling to acknowledge the narrative that you just laid out?
I'm more concerned for the diaspora, to be frank, because this war has exported political violence to the heart of the West. And I tried warning about this during my travels end of last year. We're seeing synagogues being set on fire in Australia, human beings being set on fire in Boulder, Colorado, Jews gunned down in Washington, D.C. The Intifada has been globalized. It's open season. And the narrative that says Israel is evil and should be destroyed can only go so far to destroying Israel when it has an ability to defend itself. It's much more existential for the diaspora because they're trying to purge you from polite society and make it impossible to express your Judaism in terms of any sort of attachment to Israel, because you're seen as being complicit with evil itself. Israel's position now is regionally very strong. Israel is now in the strongest regional position it has ever been in. In the north, Hezbollah is so weak it didn't even come to Iran's defense when we attacked their nuclear facilities. Honestly, it's pathetic how weak Hezbollah is. You almost feel sorry for them. The Assad regime has fallen, and the Syrian leadership is in direct talks with Israeli leadership. I don't know whether we'll see a peace agreement, but we could see some sort of normalization or non-belligerency pact with Syria. The Iranian regime has been humiliated. That still makes it dangerous. Hamas is a shadow of its former self, although it's still dangerous and still holding hostages. But Israel is now pretty much stronger than it's ever been. And it's needed. When you look at how Israel's defense exports have doubled in 5 years, when you look at the massive investment that Nvidia is about to make in Israel, when you look at the strength of the shekel and the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, it's clear that Israel's doing something right, and foreign investors understand Israel's importance and Israel's importance to the security of the rest of the world. But of course, the ideological battle being fought in the West, the projection against Israel, the narrative that isn't really about Israel. When you're having this debate about white settler colonialism, about this country full of brown and black people, it's clear you're having an argument about yourself in Canada or Australia or wherever, is very dangerous in the long run, because it threatens to cut Israel off from its allies and ultimately weaken Israel's long-term security in the service of its enemies. And I hope that when this war ends, Israel will have proven its power as an ally and dependability and importance for regional security. And so even if people don't like Israel, they realize how much they need it. And Europe, which is buying so much in Israeli arms, will understand it needs a safe Israel because Israel keeps it safe. That's the key to survival at the end of the day. You don't win on pity points. You don't win on the hope that international law is going to swoop in and save you, because that's never worked. You win because they need you. You make yourself indispensable. And Israeli ingenuity is making Israel indispensable.
It's a fascinating take. I think the public perception is that everyone has turned their back on Israel. You know, our governments are unwilling to speak publicly in support of Israel, publicly in support of the Jewish people. But if you look at decisions that are actually being made in the background, like you're talking about business investment, political decision making, whatever else, the key decision makers on this earth, it feels like still have their heads screwed on the right direction as it relates to this conflict. And you got to hope that will buoy us and carry us forward.
Decision makers are being bullied. Because of this political violence, because of the way that people are targeted. It's scary to express support for Israel because you can have some mob descending on your office or your house. But then you look at that contrast and you see when push comes to shove, how important Israel is for the West's security. But people won't say things openly and won't offer that rhetorical support because they're being violently intimidated. And I think if you live in a country where leaders are being violently intimidated against speaking up for their own country's interests, that's a danger for your democracy. It's not a problem for us, it's a danger for your democracy if your leaders think that they can't say out loud what they would say behind closed doors.
Yeah, and this is something that Natasha actually spoke about with me, and Elika Laban spoke about with me as well when they were sitting here at the desk with me in Toronto, was that this isn't just about Israel. It's about the same thing we saw, hundreds and thousands of years ago as, socialism and fascism and all of these terrible sort of ideologies rose, was how to destroy democratic values, right? Is that it was a way for them to undermine democratic values, to change the face and the fabric of a society. And, quite frankly, we're seeing the fruits is the wrong word, but the impacts of all of this already with, Zoran Mamdani in New York City, right? And I know you have to run, so we won't jump into this whole topic now, but you're seeing a change in political values in North America, where socialism is now rising back up in a way that we never really thought that it could or would, and it's very scary for us.
Look, it makes sense. we're slipping away from an Israel discussion here, but the appeal of socialism to the young in America makes sense when you consider that young people are entering the job market with negative capital, when you are shouldered with huge student debt, and buying a house is out of reach, and it doesn't matter how many takeout meals you save, you're never going to build up a deposit because houses are getting more and more expensive, and you enter the adult world with huge debts, and you've got negative capital. Why would you think that capitalism works for you? If the system isn't working for you, obviously you want to tear it down. The rise of socialism now is an indictment of the failure of liberal democracy to effectively cater for people's needs and deliver on its promises. But that's quite a different subject. And what is far more concerning for me is not that the students with huge debts are suddenly thinking about silly ideas like rent freezes, but that it's leading them to support this whole radical ideology of globalize the intifada, and the Jews and Israel are ultimately at fault for everything in the world, and it's all AIPAC's fault. That's very dangerous, because when you start scapegoating about Jews and building those conspiracy theories, it's a sign of a country that isn't willing to have serious discussions about its own problems, because it always has another bogeyman.
Yeah. Eylon, I know you have to run. Super grateful that you took the time to be with us today. I know how much you've had going on.
Next time in Canada.
And next time in Canada. And let me just say before I let you go again, more importantly, we're grateful that you continue to push despite everything. We saw videos of you in the bomb shelter taking interviews with Fox News, and we need your voice. So we're grateful to have it. Eylon, thank you. And we'll talk to you again soon.
As enjoyable as it was to give an interview to Fox and friends from inside the bomb shelter, I have my home studio set up here with my Zionist figurines and my subliminal messages behind me. You can rewind the episode and read the books in order to see the subliminal messages that I've put here. And this is the home studio. This is where I give interviews from now.
Well, it's a beautiful home studio. I know from when I bumped into you in Tel Aviv not long ago that it's just recently completed. So congratulations on getting that project done.
Thank you.
And again, it's all about messaging and communication. So I'm curious to see what the subliminal messaging behind you is myself. But Eylon, thank you.
You know what? I'll read it out for those who are listening on the audio and don't want to pinch in. Who betrayed the Jews? The world. Can the whole world be wrong? People love dead Jews.
And again, just because I feel like this conversation could go on forever, but I'll end it by saying that that's the problem, is that it feels like the end of every conversation is like, well, it's just anti-Semitism. People just hate the Jews. And
yeah, we stretched on for 45 minutes to try to give it a little more meat on the bones.
I know. We did good. All right, my friend.
Okay,
always
Jesse,
a pleasure.
Thank you very
Always
much.
good to connect.
Okay, bye-bye.
Talk to you soon. Thanks, Eylon. Bye.
Mm-hmm.